We welcome everyone to this parsha, and we're going to go ahead and thank our sponsors. So I would like to thank Annie Foreman, who is sponsoring this shir in memory of Paul's father, father, Albert Foreman, Avraham ben Michael Osher. So we thank you, Annie. May the words of Torah be indeed, I'll get back to you soon in picture. I'm just in the process of fixing this. May the words of Torah be a schus for the neshama of Mr. Albert Foreman. So we do thank you. Pareshat Noach, we know the story of the flood, and every year we try to go ahead and bring out another aspect, a different angle. So this year we have a little bit of a different angle that will perhaps relate to the world we live in today. And as a result of what we want to do here today, we're not going to cover the beginning of the flood, but rather we're going to focus immediately on the 8th chapter of Bereshit, which is in Pareshat Noach, chapter 8, verse 6 and then 7. And if you don't have a Chumash in front of you, we are talking here about the exit from the ark when it came time to leave out of quarantine, where actually Noach is able to return to this new world, a very, very new world. But before he makes his grand exit with his family members, he's trying to, first of all, assess the situation on the outside. After he makes that assessment, God Almighty actually commands him to leave. The assessment of what's taking place outside was not through Twitter, but yes, birds. Okay, in other words, he had to send out actual physical entities to figure out what is happening out there. These are images that we are all familiar with the second one for sure. So what we're going to go ahead is review a little bit what the Torah describes as his attempt to assess that which is occurring on the outside. So we are told, Vayiftach Noach et chalon hateva asher asa. So the first thing he does is that he opens the window of the ark. I could relate a little bit to that feeling because a few windows in our house are not the greatest. So what we do, this was something I remember doing in Milwaukee too, we put up a plastic around the window. So come December, you go ahead and you go to Home Depot or Walmart and you get a plastic and you tape up the window. And it does seal it a little bit better, which is good to conserve energy and to keep the house warmer. Then finally, when things start warming up here in late April, right, what do? You take off that plastic. And taking off that plastic is an experience of, that's it. I could relate again to the world on the outside. And I have that feeling that Noach had. Noach finally, after the deluge, after the flood, after waters, after being in there with these animals and garbage there, he was able to open it chalon hateva to assess what is occurring on the outside. Vayishalach, what does he send out? Et ha'orev, he sends out the raven. The raven. And now the raven itself went out, vayetze yatzov vashuv, and it went back and forth. And most probably the most basic way to understand this verse is that it went back and forth not only once, but it continued to do so for an extended period of time. And even after he is sending out the dove several times, the crow or the raven is still making its trip back and forth. What makes me say that? Because if you look carefully, it says that the Orev, the raven, was making its journey back and forth ad yaboshet hamayim me'al haaretz. This continued until the waters dried from upon the earth. Okay, meaning not the waters drying in a specific location, but rather the waters drying over the whole earth, whatever the earth refers to in this week's Parsha. Just want to mention again that the shir is sponsored by Annie Foreman, Leilu Nishmas, Paul's father, Paul Olav Shalom father's Albert Foreman, Avram ben Michael Osher. So we thank you, Annie. I saw you on now. Now, next verse, we are told that he makes attempt number 2 to assess the situation on the outside. Vayishalach et hayonah. He sends out the dove. Me'ito. So suddenly, this animal is not just sending out an animal, but one that is with him. So you could already envision that the dove was a little bit closer to him, right? Remember a few years ago, I gave a talk about pets and dogs and dog ownership. And someone, from one of the old timers mentioned to me, listen, even in Europe, people had dogs, right? They had dogs. We lived not far from a forest. We needed a dog, but the dog was outside. The idea that the dog today is part of the household, right? And that they buy it toothbrushes and they buy it strollers and it has its own toys and a whole supermarket for dogs, that's new. So there are animals that you could have, and then there are animals you could have with you, ito. And that is obviously the yonah, the dove. And he sends out the dove, lirot hakalu hamayim al pnei ha'adama. So now, while in the first verse we are told that the raven is making its journey for an extended period of time until the waters dry around the earth, here it was more local. Here it was adama, a ground, the ground where they are located. Okay, so you see a difference there. What happens with the dove? Velo matzah hayanoah manoach lechaf ragla. Poor dove finds nowhere to rest its feet, and therefore it returns to the teva because water was all over the ground, okay, all over the land. And Noach brings it back. Verse 10, 7 days later, the dove is sent out again. And then in verse 11, it returns in the evening with Ale Zait Taraf Befia. Ale Zait Taraf Befia comes back with plucked olive leaf in its bill. And Noach understood ki kalu hamayim al haaretz, that the beginning of the process of the land drying has occurred. 7 days later, what does Noach do? He sends it out again, and it never returned. It never returned. Okay? And then eventually he removes the lid and he is out. The Torah describes in great detail these occurrences with the raven and with the dove. And obviously we are going to ask, fine, we are learning about the story, but perhaps it represents something, right? Perhaps it symbolizes something. So as we try to appreciate what it symbolizes, let's understand the state of these moments for Noah. If you ever have the opportunity one day to be, let's say, in some kind of museum where every floor is different, right? Every floor is different. And you walk into an elevator, And while the scenery in one floor might look very modern, the scenery on a different floor is very classic. Okay? Now, imagine what you could do is stand in the back of the elevator facing the door. The door closes in front of you on one floor, and retain the image from that floor you just departed. And then as the doors open, suddenly you will see a completely different landscape. The scenery will be completely different. So it's an experience because you're standing in the exact same location, looking at the exact same doors, and suddenly this new world opens. And it has an impact. It's something that you could perhaps do. This is what's happening right now for Noach, his family, and actually for the animals as well. This is a new world they are emerging into. The world they left, the world they departed, was a corrupt world. Now, when we say corrupt, right, we mean far more than just misusing political power, or cheating on taxes, right? Or having complex corporate structures that you'll end up paying very little taxes, or perhaps having your son, when you are vice president, on the board of some kind of Ukrainian energy company. We're talking about corruption to such an extent that you simply can't live. In other words, yes, there is corruption today, right? So, okay, there's probably out of your taxes, there's a good chunk that is wasted. Nicht gefährlich. But imagine if you live in a world where 90% is taken by a corrupt government, right? Or imagine you live in a world where you come to the marketplace with your fruits and vegetables to sell, and this is what you're going to use. The money you use is going to go ahead and buy clothes for your children, and people simply come with big sticks, beat you up in the marketplace, and take everything you own. Or if you have a field and they just take the fruit, there is no law and order at all, right? Or you could relate it today too. You own a store somewhere and there's looting, right? There's looting done by specific members of the population. Imagine how you feel towards the world, right? It's a world you can't live in. It's a world you can't live in. When society is collapsing, you simply, have an issue that you ask yourself, how on earth can I survive? Why would I want to interact with others if they are so harsh, if they lack sensitivity, if they lack decency, and they simply don't let me live? And welcome to the world leading to the flood. When you read about the flood and you read about the destruction, this is what the Torah wants you to walk away with, right? I don't think the Torah wants you to focus so much on specific facts, on what regions it did occur or didn't occur. The Torah is a book that's teaching us ethics, and it's telling you that when there is a society that is completely corrupt, where there is no sensitivity at all to the property and feelings and the needs and respect of others, you are destroying the world, and the world thus will be destroyed. That's what the Torah is telling you. And therefore, these moments of opening up, of rebuilding the world, are extremely significant. And there must be here very significant messages, very relevant messages. So we're going to go ahead and address the person who is walking out of his personal teva. In other words, you experienced corruption. And corruption could be a government that's not functional, or it could be an institution. Imagine you're a member of an institution, right? And the institution, this country club, there's corruption in the country club. The goal of the country club is for people to come and to relax and to get along, to be kind to one another, and to feel some kind of responsibility to those who are in need. And there's complete corruption, right? Or lo aleinu, imagine if there's a synagogue, right? A synagogue where things are not done what they are as they should be, right? They forget what their identity and goal is. The goal of a synagogue is a place to pray to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to be sensitive to one another, right? To go ahead and realize that we are here for the sake of peace, there are goals in a synagogue, and then throughout our history, there have been those who have been hurt, right? Have you ever met anyone that left the synagogue because he was upset with a specific issue, right? And there are issues, but we are talking about such people because that's the moment. That is the moment. You have left the old world. The old world is behind those elevator doors. There's the new world. How are you going to deal with it? And we're going to be claiming and presenting the following. There's the proper way to deal with it, and then there's a way that is understandable, but it is wrong. It is understandable, but this is wrong. Okay, so here we go. Now we are prepared to start our discussion. Now, we are on the first day of the month of Cheshvan. Cheshvan, the real name of the month is Mar Cheshvan. The real name of the month is Mar Cheshvan. It's called Cheshvan, but really it's one word, Mar Cheshvan. There's a cute vart, which has nothing to do with fact, that it is called Mar because of its bitter. It's the bitter month because there are no holidays. It's a cute insight, but it's not the fact. The fact that it's the name of the month. Now, yes, it is a time that we have just ended holiday season, and we do not have any holidays or potential holidays on this month. I say potential holidays because the month, for example, Tammuz does not have a holiday. We don't call it Mar Tammuz because one day the fast days are going to turn into days of celebration, right? But this month really has quote unquote nothing. So we start looking forward. Very soon, supermarkets are going to start stocking Hanukkah goods on the shelves, right? You will see those candles sooner than you could imagine. In small towns like in Buffalo, where the managers of supermarkets were a little bit familiar with Jewish holidays, but not completely, we knew that Hanukkah was coming soon when they would start putting out the matzahs, actually. Meaning they knew that it relates to a Jewish holiday, but they got a little bit confused and they would put out the matzahs, and then a few weeks later it would go on sale for some reason. So we can already start our Hanukkah spirits. Now, obviously, we're not going to discuss Hanukkah in detail, but in our tradition, Hanukkah is not just celebrating a return to power for 200 years, 2,000 years ago, but something that started a revolution, a change in Judaism that will bring forth the future redemption. This is what our tradition teaches. So there's a little bit of the flavor of the future redemption already on Hanukkah. Keep that information in mind, okay? Information number one, as we're going to go ahead and assess these two birds, and I love birds. Birds are fascinating. They're magnificent to study. So as we're going to assess these birds and what they symbolize, I want you to keep in mind three pieces of information. Number one, a little bit of Hanukkah being the beginning of the future redemption. That's piece of information number one. Piece of information number two is the following. There's a rabbinic source that talks about the raven. And the rabbinic source focuses on the words the Torah uses, that the raven returned to the ark and it fulfilled its mission ad yaboshet hamayim, until the water dried up. And the rabbis tell us the following, that you could read into this verse, or perhaps they had a tradition, that this verse is telling us that the raven perhaps has fulfilled its mission now, but it's going to have a mission in the future. It's going to have a mission in the future. What is the mission of the raven in the future? There's going to be a leader of the people of Israel by the name of Eliyahu Hanavi. Eliyahu was a very committed prophet to the teachings of the God of Israel, and as a result had great difficulty in seeing the decline of our ancestors. he couldn't deal with it. And when he would preach, he would be ignored. When he would criticize the king who has the responsibility of guiding this nation to be a light upon the nations and not to be a follower in all pagan practices, he had to escape. He was the lonely man of faith, Eliyahu, all alone. And he was sitting there by a specific brook, Nachal Karit, and he was in hiding. The government was after him because he was extremely critical of their lifestyle and their behavior and the lack of values in the society. How did Eliyahu survive? So the text in Tanakh tells us, this is in the book of Kings, verse, I think chapter 17, we are told that food was brought to him by the Orvim, by the crows. In other words, he lived by a brook. Water was drying up in the land. There was Yaboshet Hamayim, and he was sustained by the Orvim, by these ravens. So the rabbis read into the verse that Eliyahu's future success of survival came about due to the Orvim. And they read it into this verse. And the question number 2 is going to be, why do the rabbis have this need to link our raven to Eliyahu Hanavi in the future, this lonely man? Okay, that's the need of clarification number 2. So we're going to suggest the following. When you look at specific animals, you have to know that they have a nature. And sometimes you can look through Tanakh to understand their nature and what they symbolize. The raven represents an independent animal, an independent bird. The raven represents a bird that is not even taken care by its parents. You know, we say in Psukei de Zimra, it's a verse towards the end of Tehillim in chapter 147, Noten li vehema lachma. God Almighty gives the animals their bread. God sustains, right? God sustains all creatures. In this neighborhood, you see a tremendous amount of squirrels, and they're all being sustained. Kadosh Baruch Hu takes care of them, right? And then the verse continues, Livnei Orev, Kadosh Baruch Hu even gives to the young ones of the raven, the younglings of the raven, Asheri Krau, who cry out. Now, why specifically do they talk about the young ravens who cry out? So Rashi shares with us that the rabbis had a tradition that the raven that's being discussed here is one that the parents, the mother, is not like the rest of the birds when it comes to birds that take care of the young, but rather they ignore the young. They're on their own, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu works it out that they are sustained. Ha'orev, say the rabbis, achzari al banav. Ha'orev achzari al banav. There's a verse in Eov that indicates this idea. So when the raven grows up, it grows up on its own. It's independent, right? It is not a bird that relies on others for sustenance and existence. It represents loneliness. You know, there's an interesting, the Medrash actually tells us that the reason the raven rejects its offspring is because the offspring has a whiteness to it, meaning the raven is black and the offspring is white. This is what the rabbis say. Perhaps doesn't mean white, perhaps it means it doesn't have the same intensity of the black. And the raven looks at these white offsprings, and obviously for the raven, only the black lives matter, and therefore it rejects the offspring. It rejects the offspring because of its whiteness. This is what the rabbis tell us. But what's relevant for us is there's a bird that symbolizes independence. That's the raven. On the other hand, the Yonah, the dove, always is a symbol of being connected to another. Yonati tamati. It's always with its pair. It's always with its mate. And as we read in the verse itself, when Noach sends out the dove itself is one by Shalach et Yonah asher or me'ito. It was with him. It's a creature that is always connected to another one. While in society, the dove symbolizes peace. Perhaps that's what peace is, that we are interacting with others, right? We're not just independent nations, but rather we feel this connection with others, perhaps, okay? Now, when you experience the harshness of a society or a group or a club or an organization that was very nasty towards the individual, your natural tendency most probably would be, let me be like that raven. You know, I'm finished. I'm finished with the shul. They weren't nice to me. They're not good to me. They talk about me. I'm moving away, right? I'm moving out to Leslie, and I'm finished. I want nothing to do with them. I can manage on my own. I can buy my own shofar. I can buy my own Megillah. Today there are videos online where I could figure out how to lane on my own. I could paskin through Google, because the fact is that I could ask any shaila today to Google, and they're going to paskin, what do I need to be in a shul where they drive me nuts, where they complain, where they're telling me that I'm doing things a little bit too fast, or perhaps a little bit too slow. Like, what do I need that for? The tendency to become like the raven is understandable. But that's not what the Torah wants, right? That independent entity is always going to be just going back and forth, back and forth. You're not going to go ahead and achieve anything. You're not going to be a partner in building the world and the mission of our existence. If you take that attitude, I can manage it all alone. Who needs it? Who needs it? Now, the raven itself and what he represents was needed at one specific point. And that was for Eliyahu Hanavi. Remember, Eliyahu Hanavi has the goal of preserving the tomorrow. Eliyahu Hanavi wants to be sure that there's a tomorrow for Klal Yisrael, right? Therefore, we invite him to every single Brit Milah. We Eliyahu Hanavi at the Brit, and we have a chair designated for him. And it symbolizes the idea there's continuity here, right? When the parents go ahead and have the privilege of performing this act, it's not a rational act, you all agree, but it relates to continuity. It's on the body part that brings forth continuity. There's a future here. There's a future here. And when we talk about the Messianic era, who's going to be the one that's going to inform us that the Mashiach is on his way? Eliyahu Hanavi. And sometimes when there is a society that is really imploding, you have to disconnect from such a society. When there is a chav, and if you just go along to get along, right, you're going to be part of the problem of destroying Klal Yisrael, and you have to preserve. It's like a seed that you take out of a city that's exploding. Then you have to be like an Orev, once in a blue moon. And therefore, the only time we find the Orev, the raven approach, as one that is appropriate is with Eliyahu Hanavi. And that's why the rabbis link the Eliyahu Hanavi's behavior and story to this story here today. But in general, you have to do things like a Yonah. You have to work with people. You have to be with people. Now, by the way, we, the people of Israel, are like a Yonah, right? We are like the dove. But you cannot create a dove society without mitzvot, without an understanding day in, day out. You wake up in the morning, you have a conversation with the Creator. You finish that conversation with the Creator. You spend some time to understand what the Creator wants from you, which is the study of Torah. And then you work on chesed. You work on concern for others, building an ethical society. That's what we are about. That's what mitzvot are about, right? When you go through Tanakh and you talk about the Jewish way of practicing Judaism, it focuses far less on details of kashrut and far more on justice. When there's justice, when there's the yatom and the almanah, when you have the orphan and you have the widow and they have an issue and they have a body to turn to support them, and the courts, based on the words of Torah, could go ahead and turn to a powerful individual financially and say, you need to pay up because you took from the needy. That's the society of mitzvot. That's the yonah. That is the dove. The dove is mitzvot. And the Talmud tells us quite often that mitzvot are compared to yonah. There's a story in the Talmud of a fellow by the name of Elisha. And during one of the awful decrees of the Romans, when they declared that one is not to be performing mitzvot, he walked around with his tefillin. He walked around with his tefillin, and a Roman official saw him from far and chased him. He took off his tefillin and he put it in his hands. And the Roman official asked him, what do you have in your hands? And he responded, Kanfei Yonah. You know what I have? I have the wings of a dove. And a miracle occurred, and it was actually the wings of a dove. And the Talmud asks, why did he compare specifically the mitzvah to the wings of the Yonah? Because mitzvot are like the Yonah. It is through mitzvot that we can have a society. A functioning society is the byproduct of Yonah. And that's what's symbolized here. This is what the message we are told here. Don't follow the journey of the raven as you are exiting the corrupt world and wanting to build a new world. Don't say, forget about the world. Don't be like a raven. Be like the dove. Now, when you want to be like a dove, you should know it's not easy. There's going to be failings, right? We try to build righteous societies. When Moshe Rabbeinu turns to Yoshua and the children of Israel and says, you're going into the land of Israel. You're going to go ahead and conquer it, and you're going to create this ethical society that's going to be a light upon the nations. You're going to go ahead and live by this book that I teach you to be concerned for the mitzvot of Hashem. They failed. They failed miserably, right? There was a destruction. There was one destruction, the destruction of the first temple, the destruction of the second temple. Eventually, our tradition teaches us that we're going to succeed, that the Yonah is going to go out, the dove, the mitzvot, the ethical society is going to go out and create and change the world. We call it Yemot HaMashiach. We call it the Messianic era. Now, we perhaps don't have yet that Messianic era, but there's one day during the week when we feel that we are in the world to come, right? Me'en olam haba, right? We come when times are good, we used to come to shul to feel that experience of the community. We are at home, we disconnect from the world, we feel we are in the world to come. Shabbat became the day that the Yonah found its rest. In other words, the Yonah did not rest in round number one, did not rest in round number two. They both symbolize the world we live in now. There's no rest. The Yonah is not settled. We are not yet living in a world where the teachings of Torah, the teachings of justice, of righteousness, of sensitivity reign. We're not there yet. But there is one day a week when we can say, yeah, Yonah matzah bo manoach, right? Yonah matzah bo manoach, that on this day, the dove found rest. It's Shabbat. Because that's like the world to come. That's like that perfect society. So back to the text. David mentioned that there was a tradition to wrap, David Wolf, there's a tradition to wrap the tefillin like the wings of a dove. That all relates to that story of Elisha. So let's go through the 3 rounds of the dove. Round number one, he's sent out and comes back. It's a failed mission. That symbolizes the first temple period. There was an attempt to go out to the world like the dove, right? and build a world based on our values, our sensitivities, our teachings, did not become the successful one that was envisioned. The second one, he comes back with a hint of a world that will be rebuilt with the dove. And what was that hint? Ale zait befia. And if you remember, I mentioned earlier that the Hanukkah story of the Second Temple period, yes, unfortunately, that era, that Second Commonwealth collapsed, and we're not in Eretz Israel, and we don't have that temple, but something from that period of time remained, and that is the Hanukkah. And perhaps you could find reference here to the Ale Zait, the olive oil, which is the story of Hanukkah, and that is referred to here because there's a hint of the future. There's already a hint of the future with the return of the dove on round 2. Round three is it was sent out and it never returned. It was out there in the world. The dove is in the world. The dove is everywhere. There is going to be a period of time where humanity recognizes that our teachings, right, and our commitment to justice and our commitment to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and recognizing that there's a higher being, right? And think about it. When last week you had in the United States of America a woman they're trying to confirm her to the Supreme Court, and she declares, I believe in prayer. I believe in prayer. I believe in a higher being, right? And the world understands, and the currency south of the border, and God we trust. There's an understanding, and we could take credit for it because they are quote unquote based on Judeo-Christian values. And let's be quite honest. What do you mean Judeo-Christian? Where did the Christians get it from, right? If my neighbor steals my tomatoes, they were my tomatoes. So if they steal my values, they're my values. These are Judeo values. Malah haaretz de'at Hashem. That is the journey of the Yonah. Okay, so a little bit we had perhaps an appreciation to these ideas, and now it's time for part 2 of the discussion of the parsha. Now, as you know, I enjoy coffee, but a good glass of wine is also appreciated. And when I read about the story of Noach, and he was a great man. Let's make it very, very clear. Noach was a great person. A few years ago, there was a rabbi in Israel that wrote for Pareshat Noach an article where he compared and he contrasted Noach to Avraham, something we love doing, right? We love comparing and contrasting. Give me just 1 second. We love comparing and contrasting Noach to Avraham. That's what we do. And as he wrote the article, there was a fellow who was a Ben Noach, committing himself to the Noachite laws, not Jewish. And he wrote the rabbi, this is not fair. Here I'm trying to become an ethical person to be like Noach. And all you Jews do is try to point out how he's not as good as Avraham. So it's something he had to deal with. But I think that a crucial aspect of Noach's life, or the fact that he is not the father of the chosen people, relates to the story right after the flood. What Noach does. So this occurs in chapter 9, verse 19, 20, where Noach, this is verse 20, the man of the earth, what does Noach do? He goes ahead and he Vayachel Noach ish adama vayita karem. He plants a vineyard. What is the first thing he focuses on? Right? You can imagine that it's right after Prohibition. Read about Prohibition. No one remembers Prohibition, but you read about Prohibition. What do they do? Right, 1933, south of the border. Right, all the bootleggers could go ahead and get out their whiskey they had to conceal, and all those made their way to get a drink. That is Noach. Unfortunately, he gets drunk, and he uncovers himself, and there's a very unpleasant section of the Torah that you have to read about, where one of the children talks about it or does worse, and the other brothers decide that they're going to cover the father, and the Torah decides to share this with us. The Torah shares this story with us, which on the surface you could do without, but clearly if it's stated, there's a message there. What happened with Noach, right? What happened with Noach? Like, what went wrong? Why did he have to turn to the bottle, right? That's the question that is addressed. So I would like to share with you the following. You know, Avraham Avinu is introduced. Avraham Avinu is introduced in the text itself, you know, as a person who departed his family, right? He did some good actions, but we find zero compliments given or placed upon him by the author of the text, right? Well, what happens with Avraham Avinu? He is born. He takes family members away from his land of origin. He then makes his way to the land of Israel, and you know the activity we're going to read about next week. His story does not start off with a big compliment. On the other hand, when it comes to Noach, think about how Noach is introduced in this week's parsha. Noach ish tzaddik tamim, and you know who the author of this book is, right? Noach was a righteous man, perfect in his generation. So this is how Noach is introduced, as the perfect individual, right? He is perfect. On the other hand, by the way, the rabbis have no problem pointing out flaws of Avraham Avinu. You know, there's an opinion in the Talmud that all of the difficult exile that the children of Israel are going through was because of a statement made by Avraham Avinu. So what I would like to share with you is the following. You know, there's a woman here in Toronto. She's a psychiatrist, and she's the head of an addiction program in one of the universities here, one of the hospitals. And this woman by the name of Leslie Buckley was asked the following question, that there seems to be some kind of issue with professional women, right? They're very successful in the market, in their industry, who come to see her because of issues that relate to addiction. Addiction starts off with alcohol, other things as well. And they asked Dr. Buckley, why do you believe, in other words, can you sum up what is the main issue that brings about to these very successful women, what leads them to these substances that destroy their life? And she summed it up in one word: perfectionism. The desire to be perfect. The desire to be perfect. And it's a little bit of a problem that we have, and it relates, you know, to women, to men too, that we sometimes feel we have to be perfect, right? Women specifically, because people place upon them the burden, in many cases, of running the household. And at the same time, they want to achieve things in the workplace, which is wonderful. But then if in one of the two areas they are not successful, they feel they are a failure, right? There are out there many, many women who are tremendous wives and mothers and tremendous people, and they do acts of kindness, but they read up about someone else who is extremely successful. They are professors, they are doctors, they are lawyers, and they say to themselves, I am not a success story. And then there are many who are successful lawyers and doctors and running businesses, and they feel, you know what, I'm a failure because I'm not at home, right? This is a struggle that exists. This ideal of being perfect is awful, is simply awful. And, you know, it's interesting. Friday night in many households, they have the tradition of singing the Eishes Chayil. The Eishes Chayil. What is the Eishes Chayil? about this woman that is able to do so many good things. Take care of her husband needs. She's successful in the marketplace, takes care of what the children need. And imagine if you read it and hear it, and you say to yourself every Friday night, especially women, Gewalt, I don't do that, I don't do that. It's important to remember that when the Malbim writes his commentary on chapter 31 of Mishlei, which is Eishes Chayil, he notes, don't think that all these complementary statements are talking about one person, but rather each person does one of those things. But if you do it faithfully and you do it with happiness, that is an achievement. Meaning there are women out there that have the need to do things in the marketplace. Wonderful. Do it with a smile. That's where you should feel fulfillment. And there are others that are doing it at home. And there are those that are doing it acts of kindness. Don't have this ridiculous expectation that every single attribute has to be done by one. Being perfect. And that's the problem, right? It's a problem, expecting perfection from ourselves, right? You leave the Yomim Naraim season, perhaps you expected something from yourself, it doesn't happen, you say, I'm a failure. That's not the Jewish way of doing things. And sometimes I feel that Noach, in some ways, he was introduced as a tzaddik, tamim. The Almighty called him, you're a tzaddik. So he has this image, I am perfect, I am righteous, right? And sometimes that is too much of a burden. It's too much of a burden. And therefore, he turned to a tool that gives you an escape, the bottle. Now, there's nothing wrong with a little drink, right? And it serves a purpose at specific times. But to start off your day, right? When a person adds whiskey to their coffee, there's a problem there, right? Because this is morning. It's a new day. I'm supposed to achieve things, right? Hopefully I'll do some acts of kindness. Maybe I'll learn some Torah. Maybe I'll go ahead and interact with society, right? Go to the marketplace, exchange, do acts of kindness by selling goods, whatever it is, it's the morning. Don't add the whiskey to your morning coffee. And so too, Noach, you are starting a new world. Can you imagine what he was supposed to do at that point? Assist his children in guiding them how to build families, build communities, right? Settle places, find out what products you could start finding in the new climate that they are facing. But what does Noach do? The bottle, the wine, he escapes. And perhaps it is the byproduct of this desire of being perfect. Now, when the Torah shares with us a story, it is a story that the Torah wants us in every generation to relate to us, to our personal lives. And one of those important messages are recognize what you are achieving in life and never expect yourself to be perfect. Expect yourself to grow. Don't expect yourself to be perfect. Because this desire for perfectionism is what leads many women to Leslie Buckley's clinic. And that's terrible. No need. You're human. I'm human. And as a human, there's no such expectation. And therefore feel satisfied with what you do. Recognize that you have limitations. Every human has their limitations. And therefore, know your limits and play within it. If you ever heard that saying when casinos advertise, you have to know your limit and achieve things within it. And that's all the Almighty wants you to do. And that label of being perfect, it's a problem even with children. It's a problem with children that sometimes children are labeled by their parents as they're such a good kid. And then when they do something wrong, the kid feels he's destroyed. Because who am I now? My parents always said, my father and mother always said I'm perfect, right? Not me personally, but they always said you're perfect. And then the next thing you know, what am I? I made trouble in school. I was called to the principal. I'm a failure. Goodbye. That's the danger of a parsha that starts off with Tzaddik Tamim, because it can lead to the bottle. Avram Avinu, on the other hand, doesn't get the compliments. We criticize him, but he's a man of journey. He's a man of getting to the next point. And the next point is becoming a little bit better, doing more things. I stumble on the way, that's fine. One step back could lead me to 2 steps forward. That's the journey of Avraham Avinu. So that's lesson number 2 from this magnificent parsha that has a lot of information. We thank Annie again for sponsoring. The Neshama of father-in-law should have an aliyah. And I thank everyone for participating in our discussion. We have a class Thursday night, 8 p.m., and Be'ezrat Hashem next week again, Monday morning. So I do thank you all. So we're going to stop the recording now.